Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, along with Dane Mizutani of the Pioneer Press, as we wrap up our series called What Happened to That Guy? But in this case, it's actually guys. And that would be the 2022 draft class, which is made up of the following players: Lewis Cine, Andrew Booth Jr., Ed Ingram, Brian Asamoah, Caleb Evans, Asamoah Tomowo, Ty Chandler, Vidarian Lowe, Jalen Naylor, and Nick Muse. Now, we are not going to go through every single one of those players, although Nick Muse did make his first NFL catch at the end of the season, and Ty Chandler had a very good breakout year in the second half of the season, likely to be a part of the team going forward. But at the top of this draft, Dane, is Lewis Cine, who was a superstar at Georgia, had an incredible NFL combine. The Vikings make a memorable trade down with the Detroit Lions to take Lewis Cine at the safety position, hoping that he can be paired with Harrison Smith in the twilight of Smith's career, and then likely take over for Harrison Smith in that same type of role. And instead, this year, though completely healthy for the entire season, he ends up with 8 snaps. So let us begin. What happened to Lewis Cine?
I have no idea. It's actually unfathomable that you can pick a Georgia player who every Georgia player hits. So I actually understand the way that the Vikings thought this was going to happen. You trade back, and if you really think Kyle Hamilton and Lewis Cine are similar in terms of just prospect and future, and one guy played on the best team in the country and was the best player in their game just down the stretch on that entire defense. And every Georgia player that gets taken is just a star. And you get the one that just isn't, that just stinks. I don't know how that happens. But I think when you kind of dissect Lewis Cine's career to this point, I think there's probably a want to look at that gruesome leg injury in London and just say, like, that derailed everything. And I think to a degree it did. Like, he didn't get a rookie season. He spent most of last offseason rehabbing an injury and was supposedly healthy this season coming in. But that probably hampered his development to a degree. But I think that's oversimplifying it. He wasn't starting last year either. Before all of the injury stuff happened, he was a special teams player. The injury happened when he was a special teams player. He couldn't beat out certain guys in training camp. Cam Bynum, who we've learned is a really, really good player, but they were giving Lewis Cine every opportunity in the world heading into the 2022 season to beat out Cam Bynum. Please beat out Cam Bynum. You're the number 32 pick in the draft, a first-round pick. Please beat out this converted corner. And that's no disrespect to Cam Bynum. He's become a very good player. Josh Metellus has become a very good player. And I think the rise of those two players has probably contributed to Lewis Cine's stagnation or fall or whatever you want to call it. But he can't beat out those two players. And I don't think he ever will beat out those two players. And if Harrison Smith retires, it's hard for me to think Lewis Cine's ever going to turn into something just based on what we saw this year. Those 8 snaps that you talked about came in a blowout against the Green Bay Packers. If that game's close, you know how many snaps Lewis Cine finishes with this year? 0. So I don't know how he goes from being one of the best players on one of the best teams of one of the best defenses in the country to being someone that cannot see the field. But that's how it's happened. And I understand people's frustration with the draft because of that pick alone.
Absolutely. And as far as Vikings busts go, and it's not over yet, but this would be one of the biggest ever, considering that he was on the team and he was healthy and they just refused to put him on the field. And if this were a defense that only played 2 safeties and 2 safeties only, then we could certainly say, well, he was just behind those other guys and they were healthy. But this defense goes looking for safeties on the street to play in situations. Brian Flores loves to put safeties on the field, and the smoking gun for how they felt about Lewis Cine is Theo Jackson, who was dropped by his team, Tennessee, picked up last year when Cine got hurt as a guy that we never expected to see, and played many more snaps in a rotational type of situational role for this team, clearly showing us that understanding of the defense, where you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to do, is very much key to Brian Flores. And there is another part part of this as well, which is that Brian Flores did not draft Lewis Cine. And Lewis Cine in college, we think of him because of his size and his speed as a guy who should be playing up at the line of scrimmage, but he didn't do that at all at Georgia. He was much more of a deep safety, which in Ed Donatel's system, the safeties play deep all the time. Whereas in Brian Flores' system, even their free safety, Cam Bynum, is up at the line of scrimmage fairly often, playing in the slot, blitzing from time to time, and playing a big role in the run defense as well. And so I think they believed when they drafted him that his ability to cover a ton of ground would be a great fit for a deep safety. And then they switched systems. But I don't think that's a good enough explanation because the coach on the defensive side is famous for finding roles to fit to skill sets, which makes you think that it goes beyond just what the role is or even his full understanding of the defense, because you could create some sort of package for him to use those skills, but they went out of their way not to, which then asks behind the scenes, is he getting it? Is he understanding it? What are the meetings like? And we don't know that because we're not in those rooms. And Kwesi Adofo-Mensah talked about what you said. He didn't have a rookie season. There is a next year's training camp for Lewis Cine, but it is extremely make or break. We have seen other players get limited time in the first couple years and then exceed after that. But that seems unlikely here. Trey Waynes is a good example of a first round pick that took a couple years and then had success by year 3. But with their safety situation, even if Harrison Smith retires, that position seems locked in for Josh Metellus to take over, or for them to even go to free agency and find another safety replacement rather than Cine. So to me, next year is officially make or break. But I think if you're calling it right now, you're probably not jumping the gun.
Yeah, and it's hard for you to kind of picture what that would look like, right? Like a guy who goes from playing 8 snaps this season on a defense led by, to your point, a man who is famous for finding places and areas and maximizing guys' skill sets in a way that they can succeed. Your first round pick in 22 couldn't even see the field unless it was in a blowout. That doesn't bode well to, uh, like I get what Kwesi was saying in the end of the year press conference, that not all guys' development are linear. Sometimes it takes guys a little bit longer, and it certainly would take a guy a little bit longer who missed his entire rookie season with as gruesome of an injury as you'll see. But at this point in the season, and I guess now we're talking on January 19th, so the season is over. But at that point in the season when he was still not seeing the field, it's week 15, he's not seeing the field, 16, 17, 18. He was healthy since training camp, since July, and he still can't crack the rotation over, again, no disrespect to Theo Jackson and Jay Ward, but those two guys, Theo Jackson, the guy you just plucked off of waivers, and Jay Ward, a 4th-round pick in this year's draft. You would think that the 2022 first-round pick would be able to find a way onto the field, and the fact that he didn't just doesn't give me confidence that he's going to find something this offseason that elevates him to a role that gets him above not only Theo Jackson and Jay Ward, but makes him an impact player in this defense. Maybe it'll happen, and we'll be sitting here saying, we were wrong about Lewis Cine, but just judging by what we know right now, it's just really hard to see how that happens.
He was inactive for a lot of games, meaning they didn't even want him to be in a reserve role if they had to.
Mm-hmm.
It is a large mountain to climb if he is going to find a spot on this team going forward. Now, Andrew Booth Jr. is a little bit different because Andrew Booth Jr. in training camp was buried behind Jawan Williams, the rookie Mekhi Blackman, and we had the similar feeling of this doesn't look like he's going to fit very well with Brian Flores. And I think that once again, this is a guy who was fit for playing in an Ed Donatel type of system that was way less aggressive. So mirroring the wide receivers would be a really big deal for this. Can you line up right across your guy and mirror him on his route, which Andrew Booth Jr. was brilliant at in college, and we saw flashes in training camp. This was much more of a corners kind of play off and then come downhill and have to be good
Mhm.
tacklers, which is some of the reason that they had high missed tackle numbers because it pushed pressure on them to make a lot of tackles in space. And we saw some issues with that at the end of the season with a Caleb Evans, who we'll get to. But I think that this was more fit than it was like Lewis Cine. Andrew Booth was active. He was a backup each week. And when he came in and played, and it wasn't a lot of snaps, it was 151 snaps, but I thought he played okay. It didn't look like he was in over his head or lost, and I could still see a development track for him. I don't know that he's the type of corner, which I think Brian Flores likes corners to be gritty, to be tough, to go after people. And I think that's a little more of a finesse game from Andrew Booth Jr. that we see. But I also would not completely write this one off as being some part of this team with the way he was able to come off the bench and be fairly effective.
Yeah, you mentioned Trey Waynes and the ramp up that he kind of had over the first 2 years, and then in year three, um, was an impact player on the best defense in the league. That's different because Trey Waynes was a first round pick with first round talent. And I think inherently Andrew Booth falling to the second round, largely because of his injury issues in college. And I think his famous quote was, "I haven't been healthy since high school." And somehow the Vikings still made him a second round pick. But he has a skill set that I think in some teams' draft boards, the year he came out, probably would have made him a first round pick if not for injuries. So this is a guy who still has some talent. And I bring up the Trey Waynes comparison because to me, that type of ramp up, that type of development still kind of exists in a guy like Andrew Booth Jr. in a way that I don't really think it exists in Lewis Cine. Again, Lewis Cine might prove me wrong. But Andrew Booth Jr., to your point, kind of endures a defensive coordinator change, kind of a stylistic change in what he's being asked to do. And he at least finds ways to contribute in some way, shape, or form over the course of this year, sometimes more than others. I remember there was a game where I think he played like, like I got it right here. He played 20, I think he played 26 snaps one week, and then it was 13, and then it was 7, and then it was 2. Like he decreased in role, and I think some of that was because we saw Mekhi Blackman really fall into a role with this team. But I'm just not ready to write off a guy who has some sort of a skill set that we started to see Brian Flores start to use and lean on, if not for just because they were depleted in the secondary when Byron Murphy was down. But there's not like a gluttony of talent in this secondary. So to think that a second round pick 2 years ago could find a role in a really, really thin, lacking depth cornerbacks room is not crazy. I think if people want to write him off as a bust, fine. I think probably some of that is because of the anger that people have inside them about the Lewis Cine failed pick. It's just like you look at Andrew Booth Jr. as a second round pick who doesn't play a lot, and you're like, that guy stinks too. I think that there is more room for Andrew Booth Jr. though to grow into this defense, to potentially grow into a role with Brian Flores. And is he ever going to be like a top 10 corner in the league? No. Is he going to be someone that could contribute on this defense next year? I think he could be. So if that's something to latch on to from this draft, like you said, you can't just write off the whole draft. It's not over yet. If he becomes the rotational cornerback as a second round pick, would you have liked him to become something more than that? Sure. If he becomes someone who you can still contribute on defense, it's a fine pick. So that one's not done. I have a little more confidence in him developing into something, probably more than Lewis Cine.
By no means was this pick a success or what they sought it to be yet.
Correct.
But I would say it's not over is the best you can do, and he still has enough talent. And I think the victory for him this year was staying healthy for the entire season, and that includes through training camp. He got banged up for maybe a week or something, but other than that, stays healthy throughout the entire year. Gives him a chance to go into an off season and look to improve and develop and have a chance to be a player in training camp next year. But that will take large gains and much more trust from likely Brian Flores will be back as the defensive coordinator. And so, yeah, is it a complete bust? I wouldn't call it, but it also is not exactly trending in the right direction. Now, Ed Ingram, the other second round draft pick, was arguably the statistically the worst guard in football in 2022, gave up more pressures than anybody else in the league, and he still finished this year in the bottom five in pressures and allowed 42 by PFF, which was number one on the Minnesota Vikings roster. And yet, he was healthy for the vast majority of the season, and his overall finish was in the middle. There's about 60 something guards that play on a given season as starters, enough snaps to compare. And he was 34th by PFF, which, not having the weak link that was there in 2022 was a big benefit. And this one is a tough pick to analyze because if you draft a second round guard and he plays average football in his second year, you can't look at that and say, well, what a bad pick it was. But at the same time, giving up 42 pressures from the guard position is way, way, way too many. That's in the same ballpark as we had from Mike Remmers or Dakota Dozier.
Mhm.
And he was not an impact run blocker either. The definition of just a guy through his second season. And when just a guy is a big upgrade, it's not exactly what they were looking for. But I think with him, you can say that there is room to grow and build on a lot of reps that he's gotten over the first 2 years. And it's still, the door is open to improving on this and becoming an above average guard.
Yeah, he's just a guy is a compliment compared to what it was in 22. So if he goes from being literally the worst guard in the league in 22 to just a guy in 23, maybe there is some development where he can be like an okay part of your offensive line in 24, or even maybe a functionally good part of your offensive line in 24. I think it's important to kind of zoom out with that Ingram and understand that while he did give up a lot of pressures this year, which is bad, you don't want that from the interior, especially if you're going to bring Kirk Cousins back. We don't have to get into that, but that's what screws up Kirk Cousins is interior pressure. So if you're going to continue to run it back with that guy, and I don't think Ed Ingram is in danger of losing his job. I think it's something he's probably set in at right guard moving forward, but you need to see more growth. But I think like I said, I think it's important to zoom out and say there was tangible growth from his rookie year to his second year in the league. It is presumable to think that there could be tangible growth from his second year to his third year in the league. He got very far behind the eight ball, being the worst guard in the league as a rookie. And I think it takes a lot of time to shed that label. And from a fan's perspective, I still think fans probably think of Ed Ingram as the worst guard in the league. So that's why I think it's important to think kind of long view here. He grew from year one to year two. If he grows from year two to year three, is it worth spending a second round pick on a guard who's just as okay? No. But I think you have to kind of reframe the way you look at drafts. If we just want to take a look at every pick and say, they're not a star, they suck, the draft is horrible, then a lot of drafts across the league would suck. If he becomes someone who is at least a functional piece of this offensive line for 5 years and he cuts down his pressures, again, is it worth using a second round pick on? I don't know. Like you'd prefer that to be later in the draft. But if he becomes a starter in this on this offensive line moving forward, that isn't just a sieve, a turnstile. Um, I don't think you're going to care where he was picked in 2025, 2026, if he's still playing on your offensive line and has developed into a guard you feel pretty comfortable rolling forward with. So it's okay. He was horrible last year. I'm not saying he's turned into a great guard by any means, but there was growth, and I think it's okay to think that there could be some growth moving forward with him too.
And they overdrafted him by the consensus mock draft boards by a couple of rounds. And so we should have expected a pretty steep development curve with him, that it was going to be a challenge to step right in. They seem to want to justify that draft pick by trading away the guy who competed with him in training camp to make it very clear the job was entirely his. And there were also times where they could have gone to his backup in 2022. They decided not to. It seems like a little bit of stubbornness when it came to that. And this year, he only mildly justified that stubbornness, but at least was not in the same ballpark he was in 2022. And I think it also speaks to it's very difficult to develop as an offensive lineman in the NFL. We see a handful of freaks do it very quickly, step right in and make a huge difference. But most of the time, it takes 2 to 3 seasons. So once again, with him, next year is going to be a make or break year. If he's the same lineman he was this year, next year, that's not good enough. But if there's a step forward, then the draft pick could be justified. Now, we'll go a little quicker through the rest of these, but Brian Asamoah is another intriguing one because he came into training camp with all of us writing him into the starting position. And midway through camp, Ivan Pace Jr. took his job, and we never really saw him again. He fell behind Troy Dye on the depth chart, where when Jordan Hicks got hurt, then it was Troy Dye who was stepping into that role. And they even went so far as to bring in Anthony Barr and play him over Brian Asamoah in a similar way to Lewis Cine, where this guy was pushed very far down the depth chart. I'm sure that being banged up throughout the season played some role in this. But if, again, there was going to be a player that Brian Flores would find a role for, find a spot for, it would be this guy who at times looked like he was lightning in 2022. Remember, made the play against the New York Giants, causing the fumble there, was a good special teams player, but did not fit. And I think a big part of that was against the run, that everyone wants linebackers to be smaller so they cover better. But if you can't defeat run blocks and you just get washed out, then you're going to get crushed. And I think what Ivan Pace Jr. did brilliantly was defeat run blocks for a guy his size. And I believe that that's why Brian Asamoah didn't see the field. And it's really hard to see him having a bigger role next year if he can't be trusted to take on guards and play well against the run.
Yeah, he fell out of sorts pretty early in camp, which was actually surprising. I remember watching some practices, thinking, "Is Brian Asamoah hurt, or is he just running with? He's running with the twos now. Oh, now he's running with the threes. He's like, he fell out of favor within this defense pretty early, and I think the idea of him falling out of favor in training camp probably really speaks to your point about he's getting washed out. He's not in the right space when they aren't even going full. So how is he going to do that at full speed? I would have more like hope for this pick if it wasn't just Ivan Pace that passed him by. Because if it was just Ivan Pace passing Brian Asamoah by, you can say, well, that kid's a freak. He's going to be a really good player for a long time. And Jordan Hicks was the leader of the defense as far as wearing the green dot, being a veteran. Where else is Brian Asamoah gonna play? But it wasn't just Ivan Pace passing him by. To your point, it was Troy Dye. It was bringing in Anthony Barr, probably partially because of the green dot duties that might fall onto him. But I just don't see a path for Brian Asamoah really finding a role in this defense because of everything you said, and just kind of looking at the context of it seems like Brian Flores has guys that he sees or is going to find ways to fit in his defense. And if he can't find a way for you to fit in the defense in year one of under him, I don't think he's just going to rack his brain and find a way for you to fit in the defense in year two. I think he's a guy who plays everybody. And if you didn't play a lot under him, it's probably because you're just not a good fit.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that one is tough. I agree to see him suddenly finding a role for next season. They'll have to either bring back Jordan Hicks or go into free agency and even go into free agency for some depth that Flores can trust. Now, moving on to a Caleb Evans, he finishes the year 71st out of 80 starting corners in the NFL in PFF grade. But the interesting thing about Evans is through week 14, we were impressed and thought that he had overall played quite well through week 14. And I went back and checked. He was closer to the middle of the league by PFF grade, which is a big win for a guy who was a fourth round pick in his first year as a starter. But I think a couple of events kind of came together. Number one, there were other injuries on the defense, which maybe then asked the Caleb Evans to do more, specifically Byron Murphy Jr., who took on a huge role. And also, there are a lot of football games in the NFL, and in college there aren't. And Caleb Evans didn't play that much in his first year. 17 games is a lot, He was also, I think, exposed against some of the better offenses when they played Cincinnati, when they played Detroit, both times, and Green Bay. These are really good NFL offenses, as opposed to the Raiders playing Aiden O'Connell, Tyson Bagent, and so forth. I think that all of those things came together, but I would say that overall he showed enough flashes to think that he can play in the future. I would not peg him as being a starter. And I would also wonder if he gets a little bit down on himself because he missed a tackle in one of the games, got pulled out of the game, and then did it again several other times with the same
Yep.
sort of embarrassing missed tackle. And he was pulled multiple times down the stretch. To me, I view Evans as a successful pick because of how much they got out of him from a fourth rounder, but also cannot play the football very well and likely isn't the type that you would expect to be a starter, much more of maybe a depth type going forward.
Yeah, Caleb Evans is a hard one to talk about because, like you said, he's a fourth round pick who they've gotten good run out of, who's being asked to do too much. If this defense was laden with talent and depth, then Caleb Evans was being asked to sometimes play because the guy's injured, or come in and be our fourth cornerback, our third cornerback, even. I think he could thrive in that role. I think he really started to struggle, like you said, and I think it was exacerbated by Byron Murphy Jr. going down when he's asked to cover the best player on the other team, when he's asked to cover Amon-Ra St. Brown, when he's asked to do these things that I get it, fourth round picks can hit, but you're not asking your fourth round pick to be your best cornerback on the team. And if you are, you're probably not in good standing. So I think the fall off, it was easy to pick on a guy like Caleb Evans and be like, he stinks now too. But I think he has a place in this league. I think he's shown that over the last 2 years. Is he ever going to develop into a shutdown corner who can take away one half of the field? Like, no. But I don't think when you drafted him in the fourth round, you were hoping he was going to develop into a shutdown corner that could take away half of the field. I think you're hoping he could develop into a depth piece that can play and can be someone that in certain areas and aspects of the game you can rely on when called upon. And I think he was that for, let's call it, 1 7/8 season, because the last eighth of this season was a disaster. But for basically 2 full seasons in the league, he's been someone who, as a fourth round pick, you would say they got a lot out of him and there's still room to grow moving forward. I remember him talking late in the season that he felt like he had bulked up too much and when he got to the NFL, and he felt slower because of it. And Cam Bynum told him, like, this offseason, work on things within your workout regimen that's going to be football moves and football centric. Because I think you see young guys, they come into the league, they're skinny, they think I got to put up a bunch of weight on the bench and I just got to get stronger. And like the act of bench pressing, like you're never doing that. I guess you're jamming at the line, but like there are things you can do throughout your workout regimen that can make you ready to play football on Sundays. And I think Caleb Evans probably could benefit from being more intentional about the way he works out, not just trying to bulk up and get big. But yeah, fourth round pick, you got a good run out of him. You probably asked him to do too much. But that's a hit in my opinion. Like I think that pick is good. Like I think right now it probably doesn't feel so much because of the way he finished this year. But if you just look at the body of work, what you got out of a Caleb Evans so far, and what you could still get out of him moving forward, like that's a good pick in my opinion.
Three of his worst four games of the entire season all came at the very end, which I,
Hmm.
I think is telling. And that's why when we look at those numbers, like a PFF grade, we always have to contextualize it because I don't think it was a horrendous season by any means for Caleb Evans. And if you had asked me after the Raiders game, how do you feel about a Caleb Evans? I would have said, what a great pick. I mean,
Hmm.
this guy looks like he's going to be able to play significant amounts of time in the future. And then the last impression was not so good. Now, with the rest of the class, we can run through this pretty quickly.
Hmm.
Asamoah Asamoah doesn't need a lot of discussion. He went to his second training camp, didn't stand out really at all, and then was cut That's kind of not something that has much controversy to it. Just was a guy that they thought might have a ceiling when they drafted him in 2022, and that didn't come to fruition. I would say the same thing for Vidarian Lowe, where a late round tackle, they end up just giving him to the Patriots. When he had to play in New England, it went very badly for him, as you would have expected. And the Vikings had great offensive line depth this
Mhm.
year with David Quessenberry had a really good season as a backup offensive lineman. At the time, they thought they were going to have Oli Udo as well. There wasn't really space on the roster, so they just moved on from him. And Nick Muse, I thought, took a big step forward by getting into a game, but also had a really good training camp. Looks like he's going to be a backup tight end for them in the future. Could end up being a player who develops over a number of years. And as we mentioned, I'm jumping around a little bit. As we mentioned, Ty Chandler, I think that one speaks for itself that early in the season, they didn't trust him. Once they did, he really showed that he has real potential and could be their starting running back next season. He ultimately could be the biggest hit of this draft class, but there isn't really a what happened to that guy. What happened was he turned out to be pretty good when they put him in the game. And Jalen Naylor, what happened was a lot of injuries, unfortunately for him. They like Jalen Naylor. He is blazing fast. He could catch the ball on deep throws, but we only see that in training camp. And even this year, we didn't see a lot of it in training camp because he was banged up the entire time, then gets hurt against the Raiders with a concussion, does not return. So a very, very difficult season for him. Out of those players, which would be the most interesting to you to finish this episode on, Dave?
I think like what happened with that guy has a connotation of like that guy has fallen off a cliff. So maybe the most interesting guy would be Ty Chandler. What happened to that guy? He didn't fall off a cliff. He rose, and I think that's probably a good way to close this entire, segment of what happened to the 2022 draft class. Because I think Ty Chandler is a good example that it's not done yet, right? Like from his rookie year where he battled injuries to year two where he kind of bided his time and probably showed earlier than he was given an opportunity that he could be an impact player to finally getting that opportunity and becoming an impact player. I think he's a good microcosm or a good reminder of like looking at drafts as a whole, because I think if you would have just looked at Ty Chandler heading into this year, you probably would have done a what happened to that guy after last year. You would have said, well, he's injury, he's smaller. Is he ever going to develop into something? And he's a good, I think his rise is a good reminder of like, it sometimes takes guys longer to make impacts in the league. And we don't necessarily have to just judge every draft by, the top of the bust that it was. I think no matter what moving forward, this draft class is going to be, it's not an A. It'll never be an A. I'm not sure it'll ever be a B, but I don't know if it'll always be an F either. And I think the names we've rifled through, a lot of them have room to grow. But closing with Ty Chandler, he's just gone from a guy who was a depth piece to a guy who showed flashes to a guy who could be a piece to a guy who I think will be RB1 next year. So, yeah, I think you could do that for a lot of these guys on this list. Are they ever going to be the starter, the RB1, the guy, the impact player that Ty Chandler will be? Probably not. But I think it's important to remember that these guys can grow and they're not just at the worst of their worst at all times. Because if you took Ty Chandler at the worst of his worst, he's an injury prone fast guy who was never going to be anything. And now we know he's actually a really good player who has an opportunity to, I think, be a pretty special player in this offense moving forward. So I'm excited about Ty Chandler. I'm excited to see where he kind of takes this. And I think he's kind of a good way to close this whole thing because he's a reminder that you can kind of move forward. You can take steps towards growth. And it's really it's going to be year 3 for all of these guys. So make or break for some. Some of these guys are already off the roster. But overall, I think it's important to kind of zoom out and take this draft class for what it is and what it will be down the road.
By the end of next training camp, we will really be sure of where all of these players stand.
Right.
And the other part of this, too, is it ties back into the decisions that were made on that draft day and a larger discussion that we won't have right now about when you can say that a draft pick was a bad idea and when you can't. And I think with this, there are a lot that you could have called on draft night. And probably if you go back to our draft coverage, we did question. We questioned Andrew Booth and his health. We questioned the positional value of Lewis Cine. We questioned the value of the trade down. We questioned drafting a guard to start in the second round that most people had projected as a fourth rounder. And a lot of those questions that we had came to fruition. So I don't think we can say you're off the hook because drafting can be pretty random when the process was very questionable
Mhm.
on draft night. But I think also then you look at the 2023 draft and the process looks a heck of a lot better, drafting premium positions like wide receiver and cornerback at the very top. And both of those players worked out extremely well. So that is the draft and why it is so fascinating. And this has been fascinating, this series, looking at what happened to that guy, and in this case, many guys in the 2022 draft class. So thanks so much for everybody watching, and thank you, Dane Mizutani of the Pioneer Press, and we will catch you all next time.